Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Hello, and welcome to the third season of the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm excited to be back. My guest today is Kanyon Sayers-Roods, Coyote Woman. Kanyon is Mutsun-Ohlone, Chumash, and EuroMutt. She is a TwoSpirit steward of Indian Canyon, an artist, activist, and educator. Kanyon teaches truth in history and envisioning Indigenous futures to diverse audiences. Kanyon's work has been featured at the DeYoung Museum, SOMArts Gallery, Gathering Tribes, and many Indigenous powwows and gatherings. Today we talk about her work to educate us on matters of decolonization, re-indigenization, and land recognition through her consulting firm. We also discuss Native LGBTQ+ identities of Two-Spirit, Third Gender, and more. To learn more about Kanyon's work, visit kanyonconsulting.com. That's Kanyon with a K, consulting with a K.com. Hi, Kanyon. Welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for being here. So I thought I would start out just by giving you a chance to introduce yourself.
Thank you so very much. Mishmin Tuhis, Conrakat Kanyon, Coyote Woman, Sayers-Roods. I said good day in the Mutsun language, and my name is Kanyon Coyote Woman Sayers-Roods, and daughter of Anne Marie Sayers of Indian Canyon Nation. I am glad to be here today.
Thank you. So Kanyon, I thought we would start out by having you tell us the story of how and why you decided to start your business, Kanyon Consulting.
It has been a fun journey. So to give context, as a California Indigenous woman, daughter of a tribal chairwoman who has been dedicating her life to advocacy for protecting sacred sites, recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples, recognizing the rights of nature, having been brought up in Indian Canyon, have witnessed Indigenous protocol, which is a common practice where we acknowledge the land and the Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the land. And we are also invited many places because some organizations want to be inclusive and ground themselves. So they sometimes ask my mother for, I'm not always a fan of this word, but blessings. The term that I use nowadays is land acknowledgements, or just grounding ourselves. And my mother and my grandmother have always shared, when song, ceremony, and dancing stops, so does the earth. I too believe that. And so when we share our voice, when we share our presence, it is part of ceremony. And as a Native person being raised in my community, it is wrong to charge for ceremony. However, we need to survive in this world. So I'm trying to bring in elements of conversations of different cultures and different ways we navigate culture sharing, instead of having the capitalistic parameter of, well, how much do you charge for this? As an Indigenous person, I say, you are seeking this. What is this worth to you? However, there are other things that I do with my business, which Kanyon Consulting's mission statement is to bridge the gap between Indigenous and contemporary value systems, thinking about ways that we can strategize sustainable futures by honoring 7 generations. And that being said, that means I talk to everybody. I consult with many groups of people, agencies, businesses, organizations, and with the goal in mind that when we honor our elders, our ancestors, our own indigeneity, recognizing that no matter where we come from peoples who are indigenous to the land of their origin. And when we humble ourselves and recognize that when we travel and live in different places, there are historical and communal cultures that have always been in these spaces, and to acknowledge the original stewards and the practices of the land, that bioregion, is so very important. So I try and bring in elements of conversation, consultation, catalyst of ideas at times, and I talk about decolonization and re-indigenization. And even to me, it's actually therapeutic, it's cathartic. It's a way that as an Indigenous woman, I could share this perspective that has been so either ignorantly or negligently been avoided and not acknowledged not been accounted for in today's post-colonial settler society. So I've been motivated to honor truth and history to the best of my ability, and a small little LLC is one step towards that direction.
Yeah, you're doing a big job.
Trying.
And thank you for being here and doing this work. So 2 words that you use that I think are hot words these days are decolonization, and another one that's probably less well known is re-indigenization. So I wonder if you could just unpack that a little bit more for us.
Well, the way I will sometimes navigate conversations, in the past when I was younger, I did navigate conversations with a racial tinge. I would say white people, but it's not of the pigmentation of the skin, it's a mentality. And I recognize that that type of conversation would sometimes elicit reaction and immediate response and defensiveness and frustration. And also, what about my fellow relatives who have taken steps to reconnect to their own indigeneity and recognize their own ancestry, and they would identify them by their names? So it wouldn't be white. It would be that their culture, their community. And so I shifted my vernacular to be Western settler colonial mentality. This mentality is negligent of the sacred. It is entitled. It is affluent, has no accountability to reciprocal energies or holistic tendencies. It is resource extractive. It proclaims itself above everything, so speciesist, and it degrades and proclaims itself above everything, all living systems. And with that behavior, that negligence is very prominent. It's not accountable to its impact. And so when I say decolonize, it's breaking down what we've learned or how we've learned it to be sure that we recognize what kind of input's been brought into our life. So, well, like I'll use today's modern concept of modesty, cover up. My community, my culture, our regalia, our traditional dress was like skirts and necklaces. We'd be topless, like the way bodies are viewed. And so when I talk about decolonization, it's questioning why society or culture or trends or how we act and perpetuate patterns of behavior in these environments. And so also with the word decolonize is to break down, destruct, break apart. And so there are times that we don't always do that. So the word indigenize, like ingenuity, but indigenize is to integrate an indigenous purview. And when it comes to colonization, many of us have been impacted by colonization for many years. California, over 250 years. The United States as a whole, over 530 years. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And even other nations have been ripped away from their earth-based spiritual practices. And reconnecting to that is reconnecting and rekindling that indigenous lineage and teachings and threads of truth that we can connect to. And re-indigenize, to my sense of how I recognize the definition, is to bring in those practices in the now. And when we're grounded in who we are, we can go forward with that modality. And it's not quite just breaking down and questioning and deconstructing, it's bringing to life and bringing into practice. Because the same way I'll say, if my mother taught me a traditional song that her mother taught her, that her mother taught her, what was that song when it was first given life? And how are we being accountable today with our practices, our rituals, or even just how we're being accountable to our communities? That what are these practices, cultures, and traditions that we're making? How are we being good ancestors in training is what I kind of bring into the thought process of these words.
I like that. How are we being good ancestors in training?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just thank you for sharing that. I thought it was really important to flesh that out a little bit more, because I think that some people, especially some white people, when they hear the term decolonization, it sounds a little scary to them. Like, what are you going to do to the city that I'm living in, right? And I get that does sound scary, but I also get that, the settlers and the colonialists, that's what they did. They came in and they stole land, they stole culture, and plowed all over that and plastered over that, right? And so I think that this work of decolonization and re-indigenization is about lifting up what was placed over and going, oh yeah, there was this other thing here before. There were these people here before. There were these practices and beliefs here before. And there's value to that too, many levels. And I think especially one of the most important levels right now is environmentally, especially here in California where the fires have been happening really badly, and as well as in Australia. And I know that some of those firefighters have been turning to the Indigenous people to get their wisdom and their support and their help to fight that and to save the land and save the animals.
Mm-hmm. That one definitely is flustering in itself, but I'm happy that it's a slow learning opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So other thing you talked about was the importance of land recognition. And that's actually how I first encountered you. I was at a pagan conference last year here in the Bay Area. And I imagine that you and one of your friends or community members were invited to open the conference. And I was really moved by that experience. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more, maybe for people who are in other parts of the country or in other countries where they don't know about that or about how that's working, because that's definitely, at least here in California, that's happening a lot more, but I'm not sure, and maybe in other parts of the United States here. But maybe for people who don't know about that, a little bit more about what that is and what it looks like.
So, land acknowledgements is a contemporary phrasing of ways that we honor native land with Indigenous communities and cultures that I have encountered in my life. When I voice into the word Indigenous or the words Indigenous protocol, it's a practice. So when you're in your home and you have a guest or someone wants to visit you, we have the common observation of they knock on the door and they seek an interaction, and then you either consent or you don't, and then they can come in, and then you have that other interaction of why they're visiting or what. That's today's common methodology, and that's with ownership of a home and ownership of the land. However, Indigenous cultures, when they originally steward their lands and their territories, if anyone were to visit, the common way would be coming humbly and respectfully. And it comes with communities sometimes bringing gifts to their hosts and ways that they announce themselves. They acknowledge their ancestors and their communities because, hey, maybe there are some relatives in these areas or connections. But this culture sharing opportunity has not been practiced, at least within the mainstream. It has been going on since time immemorial between peoples. However, mainstream society, post-colonial settler society, has not acknowledged this because it was foreign to them. And so land acknowledgements is a way to acknowledge the land, the histories, and the original peoples, the original stewards of the land, and to bring that conversation to light. And so there's even a hashtag, Honor Native Land. There is a map that a group of people decided to make. They even humble themselves and acknowledge that this map is not perfect. It is always being edited and working together, and they understand that even through colonization and the struggles between peoples, some of these observations of where territories lie and boundaries lie might still be defended or seen differently through different lenses. But there's a website that's native-land.ca, and it's a really cool map of the United States, and it has different language groups and territories. There have been efforts all around the world to bring this to light with a stronger arm. First Nations Canada is the one who totally is trailblazing, making it a formal thing, for colleges and larger groups of people to do a land acknowledgement on a political front, so to speak. In Australia, they have Welcome to Country, where they have the Aboriginal community of those lands welcome visitors to country, at least for large formal events, which is wonderful. And I find it interesting that all of us can lean to other territories to set standards. And then what's really funny is when I hear how the Indigenous community of that land is doing, usually they say, it looks like you over here are doing better. And I'm sitting here I'm praising y'all over there because it looks like you guys are trailblazing some awesome stuff. And they're like, oh, we're barely. I'm like, yes, we're using each other's as examples, and we're taking these steps to strengthen solidarity, just to recognize truth in history, because people don't know what they don't know. And our settler construct of narratives is of the winner, or of the entity that is unfamiliar with the original truths. And I'm not trying to say anyone is wrong here, like they don't know truth. It's that there has not been given the opportunity for anyone to even navigate, potentially even knowing if that exists. And it's frustrating when that type of exclusionary tactic occurs.
Yeah, and I'll also share, I'm not sure if it's produced by the same people who made that website map that you had mentioned, but there's also an app that I think is the same name, Native Land, so people can look it up. And even if you're traveling, you can open up the map and it'll just show you where you are, and it can show you what land you're on.
Could be them. I think so.
And so I also know that there are some organizations or peoples that have started creating websites where people can offer donations, or what sometimes they're calling land tax, for either, if you probably most likely for people who are inhabiting and living on that land, but also you could probably donate wherever you want if you wanted to. So is there anything you want to say about that, about people paying land taxes or making gifts in that way?
It's really helpful to become familiar with the indigenous communities and cultures on the land that you reside on. In the East Bay, what we call the Bay Area, in common term Ohlone territory, which is a misnomer, we have the Shumi land tax, which is led by Indian people organizing for change, the Confederated Villages of Lashawn in the East Bay receiving a small percentage of, if people owned land, they would be donated about 1% or something like that. And it's going for the indigenous people to get land back so they can steward their original homelands. Because all of this area, like I am a lucky native living on the only federally recognized Indian country between Sonoma and Santa Barbara, along central coastal California, west of the Diablo mountain range. And that's a tiny little plot of land that I've been born and raised on. But fundamentally, people have ancestry indigenous to the Bay Area in what is now known as Ohlone territory are landless. And it's frustrating because indigenous peoples who have that strong connection to land are able to steward and show methodologies and teachings and opportunities to connect. Native peoples do have the right to not connect with anyone and not teach anything. However, many today do and are inclusive, and it's beautiful. And it's just a way that we can recognize that this land was stolen. We ourselves may not have done any action to contribute to that, but we are perpetuating behaviors and patterns of a settler colonial mentality that supports a white supremacist culture. And we can take steps to step away from that. We may not have done the atrocious things to our elders and ancestors, but we are benefiting from that reaping.
Yeah, so because of the benefits that we have, it can be helpful to take some of what we have reaped and return it through those donations. So I have websites for the Shumi land tax that you just mentioned for the Bay Area and for Seattle and New York area. Do you have resources for any other areas in the country?
I don't have a list on me, but it's just really important because sometimes some of these organizations have been given the chance to get highlighted or to maintain that standard of like, this is this area. Becoming familiar with the Native peoples in your territory are still very important because like in what we call Ohlone territory, there are 8 language groups. And even within one of those language groups, there could be 2 or 3 bands. And all of them have different struggles. All of them are trying to do the work. They are all sovereign peoples that are enacting ways that they are being in community. And they may have struggles that can help the greater populace, but they may need help. And I'm not trying to say like come at it with a savior complex or with a patronistic attitude, but to recognize that we are living on these lands. How can we be good in community? How can we connect with truth and history? How can we think about the next 7 generations in the future and how our youth are connecting to all of these systems? And like many people feel like they've been lied to in elementary school and high school and parts of college. They just feel lied to when they encounter Native people who say, did you know this was legal? This was illegal. Did you know this happened, that happened, this happened? And people are like, why wasn't I taught this in school? And it's like, because this system of oppressive exclusionary tactics does not have the priority of honoring truth and history. So what can you do? And sometimes that actually means like, let's change some policies. Let's advocate for these other things. So it sometimes isn't always a financial contribution. It could be advocacy to protect the water. It could be solidarity with recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. The United Nations declared that. Or the rights of nature, or how do we be accountable to recognizing our patterns of behavior, our patterns of entitlement are hurting the earth, from all of the microplastics in the ocean, this concept of instant gratification, these patterns of, we want this perfect fruit. We want this not bruised, not misshapen, like misshapen is ugly. Like it has the same nutrition. So I'm trying to say like, we as community can take steps being in solidarity with Indigenous peoples by protecting and taking care of the earth and just caring. So there are other groups that may even want something like this, but they may even need capacity assistance, capacity building. We've been excluded in many circles. So when you think about education, access, from funding to the ability, or, well, how inclusive is some schooling if someone has a kid? Are we in community? No, we want to push them far, far away instead of saying like, yes, we'll be in community with your little one. I'll take care of this. No, these constructs, we're not in community in the most healthiest fashion.
So I know that you are primarily focused just in this area, but if there are people in other states and their areas that want to find ways to offer support or just learn more, would you suggest they just do a Google search, like their state or their city and maybe, Native peoples, or how would someone begin to go about finding more information to do either land recognition or start to explore that?
It's a combination package. It's Google, it's encyclopedias, it's even like archaeological, anthropological data. There's like ethnographies of territories, because a good portion of the states do have archaeological firms who recognize there's wonderful occurrences in history and they sometimes call us prehistoric, which they should be shifting their narrative and saying post-contact or pre-contact, because prehistoric, people just automatically think dinosaurs. But like other areas like geological communities and societies, national parks, some of these organizations do know some truths, but yes, it's more of a slow process of coming into communities. So it's going to gatherings. It's looking for Indigenous-led movements and efforts, and then it's connecting to people, not expecting them to do the labor for you, because that's just another settler colonial mentality of entitlement. Like, I don't know this, tell me. It's like, okay, you may not know this. What steps are you taking? And it might be a slow, painful process. As a Native person, I don't get any perks. I do have to pay taxes. I do have to pay for school. I have to do all these things. And to prove I'm Native, I have to show my genealogical history. I have to show the birth and death certificates of my family. So doing your family tree, interviewing your family and those who knew your family, looking at different records of different territories, finding out where the paper trail ends and where some original peoples could be, or who is Indigenous that came into your family. And then let's say when people do look into the like genetics, DNA studies, they may say they may be Native American. It's like, that just means you learn a little bit more. Take steps to learn a bit more. I'm going to do a tiny little cross-pollination. I'd recommend checking out All My Relations podcast. They are awesome. And so like learning from other communities, there's so many like conversations about this. So becoming familiar with that, and then taking steps to saying, okay, who are the original peoples of this land that I call home? And then finding how you can ground yourself with learning more bits of history, bite at a time.
Thank you. So I wanted to shift gears here a little bit. So recently there was an exhibit at the Oakland Museum called Queer California, and there was a video there of which you were a part of, interviewed with other Native, third gendered, and two-spirit folks. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about that identity and that work that you're doing. So I thought I know even just me watching that video, there were some people who were like, well, I identify this way, or I don't identify that way, or I don't have a label and that kind of thing. And so I wonder if you could start by saying how you identify in that way. And I also know that it's challenging because of language, not only because of English language versus native language, but then also each tribe or community probably had their own unique word, which had a slightly different definition or variation of it. So yeah. Where would you like to begin with that?
Yeah, I will say that I identify as two-spirit, and that to me, the definition of two-spirit is recognizing that before contact, before colonization, our communities recognize that, of course, we have like cisgendered males and females, and there were community roles that each of those community members would hold space for and maintain. And there's also the acknowledgement of those who did not have that identity. And I'll just call it the in-between. And that could be along a spectrum, because that could be a woman, the female-bodied being, but who identifies as a male mind and heart. That could shift between someone who has no identity or proclaims an identity, who's like, I'm not that or that, but I'm all. And it's not just a binary. And so I get flustered with this concept of like, we need a definitive term. I have used the word third gender because it was just a fast way to quickly proclaim something. However, in different defining points, I recognize that some of my mentors and elders may not identify with that term. And in solidarity with them, I'm not going to proclaim that my truth is above or beyond theirs. Every individual who is part of recognizing this has their perspective and their voice, which should be recognized and validated, because when we think about decolonizing, it's just questioning how things have been presented. And when we start reconnecting to these truths, sometimes the more we learn, the more we can recognize those elements of a deeper truth. And so as a person who identifies as two-spirit, it's that I'm of an Indigenous community. I hold space in a spiritual sense of my role in community, how I navigate that in recognizing different roles of community. And like, well, to my knowledge and through conversations and teachings and community gatherings, I've learned that in some communities, two-spirited community members hold space in the in-between, midwives, medicine carriers, or even mediators. Imagine a community of all women and community of all men not coming to an agreement saying that their truth is the only truth. How do you get between that? How do you navigate and empathize with an authentic level and then to help potentially mediate that? And the same thing with midwives, like births coming into life, or even those who are passing. All of these things, there's so many more. I can't speak to all of them because different communities have their different roles and even words. What we recognize that colonization has impacted us. So when it comes to the word two-spirit, yes, it is a late 19th century turn or phrase that I appreciate, but it is meant to hold a distinct position of recognizing a community member. So any average person shouldn't say that they're two-spirited. There's other words for it, from gay, lesbian, bi, trans, pan, a, all of these words, they already help identify, and it's two-spirit holds another element, the communal responsibility, the spiritual responsibility, the integral, accountable actions that need to be taken when that person identifies with that role, and how they are present in community and in these spaces and the medicine they carry, and how they're accountable to the ancestors and to the next generations. And that means there's an extra role there. So just because it's a fun term or a beautiful identity and it feels nice and it feels cool, we shouldn't commodify it as an identifier, as like, I'm that too. There are times that I get flustered with that. And so I'm only one individual, and these are my ramblings of the time that we come together right now. These are the truths that I am connecting to, and they've been reaffirmed over time. And I know that part of my perspective may shift at times, because as I said, I did use third gender, but also I recognize that that was a pattern of just trying to convey an element of truth. to someone, because like these concepts are very challenging to describe, given that if we're impacted by colonization and we just have some words and lack of cultural context to navigate these things, you're going to have to influence your audience or your community that may not know by giving them a lot of information and hoping that they connect to a thread of that truth, because if they are raised without a culture, so it's hard.
Another question I have for you, which I thought about in watching that video from the museum exhibit, was sort of the other side of the coin, which is that do or did Native Indigenous people ever use the term straight? Is that part of the language anywhere?
Ooh, I'm kind of curious about that too now. I'm pondering that because, like, of course, like, I'll just say, like, if there are women's roles and men's roles, and there is that common average occurrence where, well, like humans, we have proclivities and we have behaviors that we want to connect with other beings. And so if that is recognized, like from as simple as if someone wants to be married or come together, fall in love, have children, that is a normal element of the community. And the same goes for those who identify differently. There are different practices of how they interact with each other. And so I don't know if there would have been a definitive term to identify that. I can't be too sure. It would really be nice to look into that because, well, I kind of like how we use the word cis, because when you have a community that proclaims something is normal or default, and anything that doesn't fall under that parameter is then identified as other, from trans or this or that, what about the one who is sitting as normal? And like that shifts everything off, because when you have communities and cultures that encounter each other that are different, there is no default. What's normal to one community may be different than another, so you have to have clarifying terms to identify each thing and such. Like that's a deeper rabbit hole to go over some other time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd be curious to know. You can get back to us on what you find out about straight, hetero, cis in terms of historical language there.
Okay.
I also just wanted to take a moment to recognize two different communities and events that support the Two-Spirit identity. One is actually happening tomorrow here in San Francisco, although by the time this episode airs, it will be over, but it's an annual event called, does it stand for Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirit? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah, so that's a really wonderful event for anyone who's in the Bay Area or is visiting next year when it's happening.
Mm-hmm. Support them through the year too. Connect with them. They do have smaller events, little gatherings, drum circles. So not just the big event is the crazy one that you're going to be sad about missing out on. Like look them up right now and check it out.
And then the other, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about, which I think you're one of the organizers of, is the Two-Spirit Society of Indian Canyon.
Yeah, as a founder of Indian Canyon Two-Spirit Society, we have small campouts and gatherings. Lately, we haven't had a chance because the way I put it is by the community for the community. And given that I've been running around a little crazy, I've not been able to sit down and maintain an organizing mind. However, I also need my community to be present. And some of us are doing a lot of work. So it's like, all of us are talking to each other saying, we want this to happen. We'd love a camp out, or we want a gathering or a come together. And all of us are like, does this work for you? No. Does this date work for you? No. Dang it. This will work for you. And so we do invite more community members to connect with us, because even if we ourselves can't connect on a big basis, like we can have smaller gatherings where maybe if I'm not available, some of our community members to gather, or maybe even digital. So it's just a small little community that we gather in Indian Canyon, because we have San Francisco and we have places down in like LA that there are large groups of Indigenous peoples who identify as Two-Spirit or in solidarity with Two-Spirit community members, helping do the work and, offset some of the emotional and spiritual labor around, especially the education of people, because it's sometimes hard just, oh, you're Two-Spirit, let me gravitate to you and just like ask, take. It's like, are you bringing balance or reciprocal energy to this interaction? Or are you just demanding? And so I myself am also promoting the Weaving Spirit Two-Spirit Festival, first of its kind, happening in the Bay Area in Yelamu in San Francisco. And I am offering a performance, but it's also ceremony and ritual and a little view into Two-Spirit identity and holding space in community. So it's actually, my nature is Coyote Conversations. And so that is happening the first weekend of March. Counterpulse.
Yes, I will have links for all of those events and organizations in the show notes so people can find them there, as well as links to the land tax and gift offering resources that I found. And I'm also going to post some of your video interviews from other interviews that you've had.
Yeah.
So as we begin to wrap up, I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
There actually are two beings in my life that have led to the amazing thriving energies of which is my coyote, chaotic, catalytic nature of Two-Spirit wonderfulness. And these beings are Zephyr and Aiden, they're the fundamental committee members of Indian Canyon Two-Spirit Society and just amazing allies holding space in the Bay. They are indigenous to other territories. However, one lives in Yalamu and the other, for a while, lived in Huchin, and that's San Francisco and East Bay. And their homes had been open to me. Both of them are always roaming around the earth right now, so they're not there in those spaces as often. And so whenever I had a chance to connect with them, even if I had amazing ideas and plans and strategies, sometimes I can just go to their place and get grounded and connect. And actually, Zephyr's policy of opening the door for Ohlone people or Ohlone identifying community members who are doing the work, that was their, I'll call it like acknowledgement or reparations or gift, because even though they couldn't give to the Shumi land tax and they couldn't give the land back because they didn't own it, them opening what resources they had available to them in solidarity and in acknowledgement of like, this is the work being done by the people of this land, and this is important that I find a way to help or aid or contribute or just hold space in a good way. And so anytime I ever came into their space from both Zephyr and Aiden's homes, I was always safe and held respectfully and seen. And then we are in community together. Both of them are very knowledgeable about plant medicines, and both of them are very knowledgeable about the struggles navigating this world because themselves are identified as Two-Spirit. So the solidarity and the allyship and the recognition and the working together, like I did not have to work to explain things. It was just understood. And so I have grown so much having those beings in my life. And so I'm humbled by those who hold space for community and are connected to peoples. So I'm lucky to have them in my life, and I've definitely grown thanks to them.
So I just want to ask, because I've heard you use this term Yalamu. So that is a village that used to be here where San Francisco is. Is that correct?
If we look at pre-contact maps, the greater portion of San Francisco is identified as Yalamu as a location. I know that there are even just 17 little village sites along Hunters Point. So there were smaller groups of little villages. However, the greater area would be identified as Yalamu. And then there's other maps further south, like San Mateo and other areas would have other names. And then in the East Bay, Huchin is one of the larger territories. And so that's why I say people should look into older maps identifying indigenous languages to find out the original names. Because actually, when you think about some of the names of these places, some of these non-indigenous peoples were genocidal maniacs like Fremont or Vallejo, and they got the namesake for their atrocious crimes against humanity. It's a little painful.
Well, I just wanted to learn that since I reside in San Francisco and to acknowledge that I live in the place also known as Yalamu. So I guess my address would be Yalamu, Ohlone Territory, Turtle Island.
Relatively, each of those have their little discrepancies. The first language of Yalamu is Ramaytush. So the Ramaytush dialect would have been spoken before contact. And then, Ohlone is a misnomer that is identified just like Bay Area versus a county or a name. And then Turtle Island is a common pan-Indian phrase. Not all Native peoples use it, but it is a common term that can be used in a post-colonial construct. So long as it's not all you Native peoples say Turtle Island, which is incorrect. some Indigenous peoples. And yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Kanyon, where can people find you and learn more about your work if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, we have Kanyon Consulting. Both of those are with K's, so I'm KKLLC. So Kanyon Consulting is my website. I also maintain and moderate many pages on Facebook. As a visual artist, I also have Coyote Woman's Creations. And Indian Canyon is my ancestral homelands. I also represent Coast-to-Noan Indian Research, which is a nonprofit. My mother and myself are holding that down with our board. And yeah, I'm on the internet. I'm on Instagram. I think Kanyon, patreon.com/Kanyon, I hope. Or it's /Coyote Woman. I'm on Patreon. I need to update it. I need love. And I'm just active, crazy, nomadic native all around. So just keep an eye out for Kanyon with a K, Coyote Woman.
Okay. And once again, I will have those on the show notes. Well, Kanyon, thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful having this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you for your time.
Do you feel lost or stuck? Or are you alone on your healing journey? If you're seeking guidance or support, I'm here to help. I offer online coaching and counseling for queer spiritual folks from all over. Schedule your free consultation with me now by going to queerhealingjourneys.com. I look forward to supporting you on your path. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.